President, please be seated. The court is now in session. Today, the Chamber continues to hear testimony of Mr. Expert Hinton. And before we proceed, the Chamber wishes to inform the parties that for today's proceedings, Judge Claudifens is not available due to health reasons, and after judges of the bench deliberated the matter, Judge Martin Kropton, who is a reserved international judge, is replacing her seat at the bench, and that is pursuant to Rule 99.4 of the ECCC internal rules. Ms. Jia Siu-Huang, please report the attendance of the parties and other individuals to today's proceedings. Greffier. Mr. President, for today's proceedings, all parties to this case are present. Mr. Nuji is present in the holding cell downstairs. He has waived his right to be present in the courtroom. The waiver has been delivered to the greffier. The expert who is to continue his testimony today, that is Mr. Hinton, is present in the courtroom. Thank you. President, thank you. The Chamber now decides on the request by Nguyen Chie. The Chamber has received a waiver from Nguyen Chie, dated 17 March 2016, which states that due to his health, that is headache, back pain, he cannot sit or concentrate for long, and in order to effectively participate in future hearings, he requests to waive his right to be present at the 17 March 2016 hearing. Having seen the medical report of Nguyen Chie by the duty doctor for the accused at the ECCC, dated 17 March 2016, which notes that Nguyen Chie has back pain and feels dizzy when he sits for long, and recommends that the Chamber shall grant him his request so that he can follow the proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs. Based on the above information and pursuant to Rule 81.5 of the ECCC internal rules, the Chamber grants Nguyen Chie his request to follow today's proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs via an audio-visual means. The Chamber instructs the AV unit personnel to link the proceedings to the room downstairs so that Nguyen Chie can follow. That applies for the whole day. The Chamber now hands the floor to the defense team for Keo Sampon to continue putting further questions to the expert. And if counsel, please hold on, and International Deputy Co-Prosecutor, you have the floor.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honours. Good morning, Counsel. I certainly want to be very brief. Just briefly in relation to two requests, in relation to the prosecution's application to have further witnesses for the Phnom Kroll Security Centre segment, which we filed yesterday, E390. Defence Counsel for Khieu Samphan have asked that discussions be had in relation to that on Monday. We would ask that, because they need extra time to look at that request, we would ask that you consider hearing that this afternoon after the witness has finished, giving Khieu Samphan's counsel some time to review the motion. That's our request, because obviously the proceedings are moving fairly rapidly, and that will help in the planning rather than leaving it to Monday. That's the first brief request. But Mr. President, in relation to this expert, I just wanted to raise one matter, and I hope that by raising it now, it'll speed up the proceedings this morning. Your Honour, yesterday I think we could see that there was some difficulty in the expert being able to respond to some documents when the proper context was not put forward to him in some situations. And Your Honours are aware that the parties gave the expert a large number of documents on the 7th of March. But in those documents, I think most of the parties, including the prosecution, didn't include the precise ERN number of each page. So in effect, the expert received maybe 4,000 pages of documents, and obviously I'm sure he made some attempts to look at it, but as far as reading all the material, that would have been impossible within 7 days. And that's why obviously Q Sampan's counsel has prepared a binder with specific excerpts. But be that as it may, we don't have much time in the proceedings, and I understand Q Sampan's counsel would like to get through the questions as quickly as possible. But based on the concerns that were raised by the expert on a number of occasions yesterday, he conveyed that it's difficult for him to answer on new pieces of evidence which he hasn't seen before because they've been introduced in this trial without a certain context. So Q Sampan's counsel has been doing it. They've obviously been giving the E3 number, the ERN numbers, which are largely obviously very helpful to the parties, perhaps more than the witness, but very helpful, of course. But I would also ask that on a systematic basis, that in order for this expert to provide an opinion that has a certain value, that some additional information be given consistently when a document is put forward. And I believe a number of documents are going to be put forward, and I see counsel nodding ahead, but particularly to assist him, the date of the document, if it's contemporaneous, the type of the document, the title of the document, who the document was sent by, who it was received by, and particularly we see some statements and some transcripts on Q Sampan's list, particularly the date of the incident that Q Sampan's counsel may want to put to the witness, and also particularly the location, the village location, and also in the context of the province or the sector or the zone, and also the nature of the person that's giving the information, whether the person's a Khmer Rouge cadre, a Khmer Rouge soldier, an ordinary person, a Cham or Vietnamese, and the context in which that piece of information is given. And we ask that, Your Honour, because the expert has said yesterday that it's very difficult to give an opinion on what something means in light of his thesis in terms of the treatment of the Cham and Vietnamese, unless he understands the temporal variation, what time the incident occurred, and the spatial, the geographic variation. I'm sure counsel is probably going to do most of this, but because it arose as an issue yesterday, not necessarily with Q Sampan's counsel, that it's very difficult for him to comment on new material if that context is not given. So lastly, Your Honour, I'm not sure whether it will be helpful to the expert, but in terms of trying to put whatever documents might be put forward by Q Sampan's counsel in a geographic setting, I do have a copy of Ben Kiernan's map that was in his book. That's E3/1593, and that's an English ERN 0114-9979, and it's a copy of his map of the zones in Democratic Kampuchea and the sectors, and perhaps the expert may like to refer to that. So that's my submission, and hopefully when documents are presented, they'll be put in context so he's able to respond in a thoughtful and a meaningful way. And I'm just wondering whether this map could go to the expert if he in fact thinks that would assist him, and I have other copies.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, everyone. I would like to make a number of remarks. First of all, on the co-prosecutor's application E390. The first remark is that since I sent a mail and I had to make an application on this before responding to that application, it appears logical in view of the manner in which these proceedings are moving forward. I regret that I was not able to present my application, but I maintain it all the same. But as we told the co-prosecutor yesterday, we received at 13:35 a courtesy copy of an application for the appearance of a new witness on the segment that is underway. And I'm being told by the co-prosecutor that we should press on and hurry up with the examination, and that is why I am just asking that as part of a normal case procedure, we should be given 10 days to respond. So we shouldn't be given less than 24 hours. That is why I'm talking of Monday morning. And yet I hear the prosecutor say that we should move forward quickly. My first remark on this point, which is in line with my application, my request to be able to respond concisely, and it is in the interest of the proceedings that all the parties be enabled to speak up. As you've noticed, we are examining the expert witness, and we cannot within 3 hours deal with this application, and that is why we would like to take time to look at the application before responding. That is why I'm asking that we should be allowed to respond on Monday. As regards the expediency of the proceedings, if the co-prosecutors are requesting that some witnesses who are deceased are to be replaced, if the co-prosecutors were so bent on ensuring that these proceedings move forward quickly, they should have filed that application a lot earlier rather than do so this morning. And that's why we are asking for a few days to be able to respond to that application. I do understand that it's important to move forward quickly, but we also have the issue of equality of arms, which is also important. The co-prosecutor himself made that application, and we, the defense, are those who have to respond to that application, and that is why I would crave the indulgence of the chamber as well as the prosecution so that we can respond on Monday. The timeline is reasonable. It is not extraordinary. And this is the first remark I wanted to make regarding application E390. As regards the new specific conditions that the co-prosecutor is proposing, I wouldn't say imposing, as regards the examination of the expert. Any new documents that we may wish to provide to the expert are such that I am somewhat surprised by what the co-prosecutor said, because the co-prosecutor is not mindful of the same criteria which he would like us to comply with today. Let me remind the chamber that yesterday, when my colleague of the Nuntia team presented a number of documents providing a version and explanations, he was faulted for giving his version of the facts and asking leading questions and presenting his own version of the defense case in the interpretation of the documents. I, for my part, am trying to present the situation as clearly as possible. I believe that the co-prosecution and the civil parties may object to some of the presentations I'll be making, and that is why I did comment explaining to Mr. Hinton how I would proceed. If there is any interpretation that is biased on my part, I would stand corrected if the co-prosecutors object to my questions. And without any further ado, given that we are running out of time, I would like to proceed with my examination, and I don't think we should be required to follow these proposals made by the co-prosecutor. The co-prosecutor may object to any questions I ask and ask for clarifications, but I'll try to do my best to place the facts in context. The co-prosecutor has completed their examination, and now I, for my part, will present any documents that I consider relevant to my examination of the expert.
President, on the submission by the co-prosecutors to hear additional witnesses in place of those who were deceased, the chamber will make that decision after the short break this morning. As for the proceedings, let we proceed with what we have now, and if the other party wishes to object to that, you may do so, and that is the standing practice in this chamber. And the chamber would like to remind the defense team for Kirsampon not to interrupt the expert when he is responding to your question. He is an anthropologist, so he has a great wealth of knowledge, and he's not a simple witness. For that reason, the chamber needs to hear his expert responses during his testimony. And lastly, per request of the co-prosecutor, the chamber allowed you to do so, that is to give the decay map to the expert for his examination. Since this file is already on the case file, and actually the map has been used on several occasions in the proceedings before the chamber. And court officer, please deliver the document to the expert for his examination. And defense counsel for Kirsampon, you may now proceed with your questioning.
Dans ces conditions, est-ce que
Under these circumstances, may I request the co-prosecutor to also give us a copy of the document he has just given the expert, because we don't have a copy of that document.
Your Honour, it's the one in Ben Keenan's book, and I have about 10 copies if counsel would like them. I think they've received one. I have copies if Your Honours want them.
c'est bon, Monsieur l'huissier?
Very well. The court clerk has just given me a copy of that document.
Bonjour, Monsieur Hinton.
Good morning, Mr. Hinton. I am sorry about these delays in proceedings this morning. I would like to continue my examination in light of your testimony. I refer to a document with exhibit number 5, and it is an article by Steve Heder, which I believe you're aware of, because it is in the biographical references in your book, and this article is a critique of Ben Kiernan's book, document E3/3995, and I would particularly focus on a passage whose ERN in French is 00 00832. And perhaps I should have started with the ERN in English. Yeah, and I think there is the ERN in English is 00773767, and the following pages, and in Khmer 008446112, and it goes up to 14, and the passage is 602 in Khmer. In this passage, Steve Heder refers to a notion you have referred to on several occasions in your testimony before this chamber, and that is the notion of a Khmer body and a Vietnamese mind. May I ask you to comment on this particular passage? And it is the second paragraph in French. This is what Steve Heder says, and I quote: "In his attempt to argue otherwise, Kiernan highlights the fact that many of the East Zone victims were stigmatized with the epithet Kluong Khmer Kbal Yuan, which he translates as Khmer bodies with Vietnamese minds, and which he suggests racialized those killed. This phrase, which might also be translated Khmer bodies with Vietnamese heads, had also been used historically to conjure up images of Khmer political structures under Vietnamese leadership. Kiernan's argument that the phrase was used to suppress the Khmer majority on the racial grounds that they were not really Khmer is at best incomplete. Instead, the phrase suggests political leadership and political orientation were considered more important than any biological determined physical characteristics. Being physically or racially Khmer was no protection. Treason to the class and national cause was political and could not be committed by anyone, regardless of skin color, eye shape, or hair texture, who was suspected of refusal to accept and be loyal to the correct political line of the proletarian vanguard leadership. End of quotes. So I would like to have your vision as an anthropologist on the elaboration of this interpretation made by Steve Heder, who is, of course, a very well-known author, well known for his work on the Democratic Kampuchea regime.
Thank you. And also, I should add, I believe that we had a translation issue yesterday in terms of how I should refer to you. And I just wanted to clarify that counsel is the preference, or madame, because there was a translation in the French that was expressed. So I want to make sure that I address you as you wish.
Well, really, Mr. Hinton, it's as you wish. I am counsel, and madame, it's up to you. No problem.
Okay, thank you, counsel. So, in terms of this article, I think it's a very interesting article. Both the work of Steve Heder and Ben Kiernan is important. They both made contributions. They agree about certain things. There is a difference in how they interpret the events. We'll both talk about the importance of Marxist-Leninism. Steve Heder puts it more at the forefront of the driving dynamics of the killing that's taking place. And again, Ben Kiernan emphasizes that, but he looks at race as a more driving force. I don't want to reduce Ben Kiernan down to more of an intentionalist perspective, because I think he recognizes the importance of Marxist-Leninism. But in this article by Steve Heder, he's more suggestive that he's an intentionalist. And to go back to my discussion before, intentionalism, this is an idea that comes out of the debate on the Holocaust that he uses in the articles that you have in the folder, is the idea that there was sort of a pre-existing, long-standing intent to destroy a group versus, because of something like race, versus a process, structuralism, sometimes how it's referred to, that unfolds over time. Steve Hetter's argument in this article is he's emphasizing Marxist-Leninism much more and the structuralist perspective, that over time, as events moved on, and it echoes what I've said before in many respects about the attempt to get different groups to fashion their consciousness, right? And as that unfolded over time, and eventually as we moved into 1976, and you began to have the purges, whereas you have an initial attempt, I think, to bring people into the countryside to sharpen their consciousness regardless of class background, and that's sort of putting aside the fact there were initial killings, especially with Khmer Republic officials. Once we get to about 1976, moving into 1977, the situation changes. So I've talked about this notion of cumulative radicalization that takes place with different trajectories. And when I've talked about it before, I've mentioned that the trajectory for my interpretation of the attacks on ethnic Vietnamese is that there was more of a racist strand that was there from the beginning, where the course with the Jam seems to unfold more along the lines of a thing where they rebelled, and they were, as you said yesterday, scattered, even as they were regulated and controlled, and then more towards 1977 they began to be targeted. This part of his of Steve Hetter's discussion, he's referring to the East Zone massacres in this phrase that was used, and I think probably Ben Kiernan, I'm sure, would agree with Steve Hetter on the point that this is a term that was used, like the word UN that we've discussed so much, and can be mobilized in different sorts of ways, but it became a common phrase. I mentioned before that, Ben Kiernan, he says that is at best incomplete. So he's not necessarily completely disagreeing about that. He's saying it's incomplete. But they do disagree on the sort of prominence of this. Steve Hetter's asserting that we need to look at it more before making sweeping conclusions. So the question of the East Zone and the purges of the East Zone and how that might play into, for example, a charge of genocide, as I said before, it's possible to make the argument has been made, for example, in Argentina and some of the local courts.
I apologize. I know that Mr. President asked me not to interrupt you, but here, maybe I wasn't very clear with my question. I accept it, but I'd like to be more specific, in fact, with my question before we continue, because here you spoke about the word "yun" and all that. So my question was really focused on the expression "a Khmer body with a Vietnamese mind," and I wanted to know how you relate this to what your vision as an anthropologist is of this expression. I really wanted you to focus on this expression only.
Thank you, Counsel. It's, as I said before, it's difficult. This article is a very complicated article, and I'm trying to set it in context. So it's hard for me to give yes/no sorts of answers to something. I mean, it's a very nuanced argument, and it's an important argument because it refers to Marxist-Leninism versus a notion of race being a driving force, which I think speaks very directly to some of the charges here. But the short answer, if you're looking for a short answer, would be that this phrase, along the lines of the use of "yun," is a term that can be mobilized and used in different sorts of ways, depending on the overall context of, in the case of incitement, that's taking place. So you need to contextualize it and see the way that it's being taken and deployed.
Another point that I would like to discuss with you in connection with this notion of spatial temporal variation, and therefore of the importance of knowing what happens when you take a document and that you examine it. I wanted to know if in your research you conducted specific research on the issue of the border conflicts, or if this was something that was secondary in your research.
Thank you, Council. So again, as I've said before, my focus for this book project, which everyone said we should focus upon, was predominantly the lived experience of people linked to this village banyan, the people living in Kampong Siem district. But as a scholar, in order to understand the events taking place on the micro level, I also had to, of course, become aware of the larger historical context. I didn't go and do primary research on that topic. I relied more for that on secondary sources and understanding of, as well as CPK documents, FIPAS broadcasts, so on and so forth.
I understood that you consulted documents at DCCAM when DCCAM was not as well organized as it is today, and I understood what you said about this yesterday, but I wanted to know if in particular, and this is connected with the meeting of the Standing Committee that I would like to cover with you, which is at tab 2 in the folder I gave you. It's document E3/221. And I wanted to know if, before today, if you looked at these minutes of the Standing Committee of 14 May 1976. Have you looked at these minutes when you conducted your research, or is this a document that you only discovered recently? That's my first question. Then I will continue.
Thank you, Council. It's hard to remember, but I don't believe that I had seen this document before. But again, there are many documents over many years, so I can't be certain about that.
Well, let's be clear about this. I understand that in relation to the mass of documents, of course, you weren't able to cover all of them, so no problem about this. Well, a general question now. Regarding the border fighting between DK and Vietnam, in your research or in your reading of secondary sources, did you cover the issue of the Brevier line, and did you go over the discussions regarding the Brevier line? Does the Brevier line somehow remind you of something of what you might have covered in your research?
In my research in general, thank you, Council. In my research in general, it's something, obviously it's been there in this particular project. I don't believe I discussed it in this book.
I would like to look at certain segments of this document with you, which, contrary to other minutes of the Standing Committee, is focused or lists who speaks and who is making observations on the issue in question. And the document is titled The Study of the Vietnamese Reaction During the 5th Meeting on the morning of 14 May 1976. And this is a negotiation process with the Vietnamese about the border problem. And at ERN 00386-178, at Khmer ERN 0000813, and at English ERN 0018265 onto the following page, 96 therefore. And this is the remark of Comrade Pugh. That's Son Sen's alias. And so he is representing, of course, the armed forces. And this is what he says, speaking about the Vietnamese. At the border, they would continuously penetrate. We did not try to start any problems with them. Based on our experience, when they would enter, and if we didn't push them back, they would not leave. And when we were strict, they would leave. This happened in Ratanakiri province. I'm reading directly from the French, whereas in Mondulkiri province, we did not attack them at all because we respected the guidelines of the party, indicating that we shouldn't be that severe. And then the Comrade Secretary Pol Pot, a priori speaking, says that according to this discussion, do they want to make time lag on in order not to break the negotiations? That's one thing. Second thing, did he say that they were representing the guidelines of their party, or did he arrange them in his own way? And third, they would wait and see if we would change our minds. Fourth, what is the interest of these negotiations for us? End of quote, free translation. So in this specific segment, and this is why I'm going to ask you to react, which is, I'd like to understand that in your research about the general context, do you remember that in May 1976, discussions with Vietnam on the border issues were taking place? And do you make a connection in your research on Region 41, because that's the region, of course, that you focused on in particular? Do you make, therefore, a connection between what might have happened on the field in May 1976 and the negotiation process between DK and Vietnam?
Thank you, Counsel. Again, my concern was to discuss the lived experience of people from Banyan and the surrounding area. Having said that, I was familiar with the work, for example, of Nyan Chanda, at the time, other scholars, David Chandler, who had written about this process of back and forth that took place over time, and certainly, as I mentioned yesterday, the sort of dialogic process between the DK government and Vietnam trying to figure out what each other's intentions were, and eventually you had initial skirmishes in 1975. Over time, eventually by the time we got to 1977, they began to escalate. Into 1978, they escalated dramatically. So this appears to be, I believe you said it was 1976, a moment when the DK regime was trying to assess what strategy they should undertake and what the intentions were of Vietnam.
Fine. So what you're saying, in fact, aside from this generic context, are you saying, in fact, that you're making a difference between the elements you found regarding the temporal gradation of the problem between 76, 77, 78 in relation to Region 41? So do you make a difference in the elements that you gathered from the people you interviewed?
Thank you, Counsel. I'm not sure that the translation things came through quite. In terms of the elements, what are you referring to?
Maybe I wasn't very clear about this, so let me repeat. My question was, you said that you noted the moment when the negotiations took place, and you noted when the skirmishes became more and more intense. So my question was that in your research in Region 41, even if it's true that you said that there were few Vietnamese people living in that region, so in among the elements that you gathered from the people you interviewed, did you note a difference in the facts that were related to you between the moment when there were negotiations and the moment when there was an extremely clear armed conflict?
Thank you, Counsel. So again, if we're restricting to the context of my book, Why Did They Kill? This was not something that people talked about as part of their lived experience. I think it was more reflected, as I said before, by the temporal trajectory of events. As I said a little bit a while ago, in 1975 into early 1976, things seemed to have been more moderate, and then they began to pick up in 1976, moving into 1977. But certainly, and I would say the one other dimension more broadly that is reflected is the fact that when Riep was purged and taken away, when he attempted to rebel, I should say, and was taken to S-21, he was replaced by Pal, who brought people from the East Zone to be killed in that area. So in that sense, it reflects the broader historical process. But people, and then there are a couple of people who were enlisted, who were recruited at the time from this village.
In continuation of the notion of historical development and the development of the conflict with Vietnam, I'd like to get back to a document that you commented with the co-prosecutor, which is document E3/4604. It's tab 3 in your folder. And this is a speech by Pol Pot from April 1978. And you might remember that I made an objection when you made your comment, and I said that there was a problem in terms of context, and you answered the co-prosecutor's question, but I'd like to get back to certain passages of the speech, and in particular to passages that predate the passages that were quoted by the co-prosecutor. So the first passage that I'm interested in, because the date of this speech, which is in a Revolutionary Flag issue of April 1978, and it's at an important moment, and this is at a moment when the conflict with Vietnam became particularly intense, and I would like to refer you to the English ERN. It's on page 4, 00519832. Khmer ERN 000647111, and French 005203442. And I would like to read out to you a first excerpt so I can place things back in context. In French, it's the penultimate paragraph on the page, and it begins as follows. In summary, on 6 January 1978, we smashed the aggressor Yun forces and drove them completely out of our territory, and smashed 29,000 of their forces, including both those killed and those wounded, breaking 5 of their divisions. By breaking, I mean that their troops were destroyed and were no longer operational. They had to be reorganized. This was our first victory during the first round. While we were fighting the enemy and seizing this first victory, we had still not yet organized our forces well. The forces of each zone, like the military forces of the party center, had not yet been prepared and readied for this kind of large-scale combat. Neither personnel nor weapon strength was really ready and strong. However, we stuck and smashed them and made them withdraw from our border on 6 January 1978 when they lost round 1. They had to attack us again in round 2. End of quote. So my first question, 6 January 1978, end of December 1977, do these dates ring a bell to you, and do these dates mean anything to you or did they mean anything to you in your research regarding the fighting between Democratic Cambodia and Vietnam?
Thank you, Council. So we're looking at the revolutionary flag, April 1978, just to make sure I'm looking at the correct document in terms of the dates. Well, I guess there are sort of two issues. One is whether I was focused upon this document. I do mention it, I believe, in my book. I think I do. I have to check the references. But yeah, no, I was aware generally of these sorts of documents. In particular with this one, it's a time when basically open war has been declared between the DK regime and Vietnam. Clearly at this point, Son Sen's gone to the border to fight. But in general, I think your point that it's important to take the article as a whole and to look at the broader context, historical context, to look at everything in it and not look at it piecemeal. I think it's clear that this is directed in large part towards military attacks, the fight with Vietnam and the use of the UN. But I would add as well that the use of the word UN, as I said before, has multiple valences, and using it as incitement as well in general, also would inflect upon ethnic Cambodians, ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia. And then when you get lines like the thing about the seed that comes before, where there is not one seed left, that the office of the international deputy international co-prosecutor mentioned, you also have those that are in this. So I think this definitely is directed in part towards the broader military conflict, and they're directing the use of the word UN in relationship to Vietnam, but I think as well it's a form of incitement towards UN and ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia. So I think it reflects both of these valences, if you look at some of the attacks as well, and just in trying to get a sense of the incitement, Nyan Chanda's reporting, I think it was in August, when there were border incursions and DK forces went in and perpetrated a number of abuses, very violent acts, and Nyan Chanda said something to the effect is he was really shocked even in all the years of his reporting. I think that sort of incident illustrates the strength of the incitement that's implicit in much of this rhetoric, both in this document and in many other documents. But I think your point that you need to look at the larger context, and it is certainly military, but it also inflects towards ethnic Vietnamese in general.
I understand that you interpret this as having had an incident on people of Vietnamese origin, but regarding this passage that I quoted in particular, here they are clearly speaking about fighting that took place in December 1977, and that resulted, of course this is Pol Pot's interpretation, but that resulted in a victory by DK. The terms that are used in the segment that I read out to you are division, fighters, they're clearly military terms. So my question is, in this segment, and do you see in the segment an incitement to attack people of Vietnamese origin? I'm clearly asking you, is that your vision as an anthropologist in relation to the meaning that you want to give to what you gathered from your research? But when you look at this document, concretely speaking, knowing that it might be important to remind that this is a speech that was given on 17 April, so they're speaking about all of the military victories and the victory of 17 April, etc. Do you see in this segment that I read out to you a call, an appeal to kill people of Vietnamese origin, whereas they're speaking here specifically about fighters and about armed forces only?
Thank you, Counsel. So to reiterate again, as I said before, I think it's quite appropriate and important to, as you've noted, to pay attention to the broader context of a document like this, to everything that's in it. You know, the passage you read, I had the yellow highlighted version. I wasn't sure, as I followed along, where you were. I don't think you were necessarily in the part that I had highlighted, but I listened. And as I said before, there absolutely one intention, and an important intention of this, was to stir up the troops who were fighting against Vietnam. But as I also said, the word UN is used. When you use the word UN, it has two valences. It can refer to people from Vietnam, Vietnamese troops, but it also stirs up incitement against ethnic Vietnamese who also are referred to as UN, often in strong racist terms in Cambodia or DK at that time as well. So it's not possible, when the word UN is being used, it's a word that has, as I said before, it's a multivalent symbol. It has multiple meanings, and to use the word isn't a sort of singular directive. It's something that inspires, incites hate towards ethnic Vietnamese in general, even when it's directed, in some contexts, some parts of this, towards the military troops of Vietnam. So it has both, are implicit in the use of the word, and there are also passages like the "don't leave one seed," there wasn't one seed left in Cambodia, that speak more particularly, I think, towards the elimination of ethnic Vietnamese in democratic Kampuchea that are borne out by the demographic numbers as well.
A question, when we're dealing with terms that might have different meanings in a different context, if we're dealing with a context as what I see when I read this document, but when we are dealing with a context where the word "yun" is associated with divisions, with battles, with divisions, with victories, victories over armed forces. In that case, and in that context, the meaning is only about enemies, about enemy forces. Of course, I understand that in another context that "yun" might mean something else, might be applied to a civilian population. Of course, that I don't disagree with. But in this particular context, when they're speaking about armed forces, about divisions, about fighting, I'd like to know how you manage to deduct from this that they are also speaking about the civilian population.
Thank you, Counsel. I think it's quite easy to do so. I could provide other examples in the aftermath of 9/11 in the United States, when the government began to talk about Muslims and Arabs in derogatory terms as barbarians and savages. In the United States, there began to be attacks on people who often, for example, Sikhs, who were perceived as being quote-unquote Muslims or Arabs in some sense. And so you had the use of this term that was directed against terrorists in the Middle East, yet resulted in attacks on people in the United States. When you use racist rhetoric, it's a rhetoric that, when it's diffuse and can refer to a group in general, again, it inflects towards the troops. I think you're absolutely right, but the term is multivalent, and it also incites hatred against ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia. The term, as I said, has been used historically in this manner. I directed the Nguyen Gia co-defense lawyer towards the article by Penny Edwards that discusses this as well in relationship to the UNTAC period. I don't think this is at all controversial to say if you use language of incitement, things that are effectively slurs to direct against a military opponent of some sort, it doesn't inflect broadly towards all the people that are perceived in that term. In my book, I talk about the process of manufacturing difference, marking difference, stigmatizing groups, the mobilization of languages of hate as part of that. So if you take the term UN, it's a term that can refer, as I said before, over and over again, both to the military in this context, but if you use it, it stirs up diffuse, generalized incitement towards Vietnamese, including ethnic Vietnamese, in Cambodia, or DK at this historical moment.
Sur la question
On the issue of 1 against 30, on which you commented in answer to a question put to you by the co-prosecutor, is also an issue on which I would like you to comment, particularly with regard to a speech made by Pol Pot. In that speech, mention is made of the disparity between the Vietnamese and Cambodian forces. And this is what he says with regard to that disparity, and it is page 6 of your book. In English, the ERN in English is 00519834. ERN in Khmer 000647114, and the ERN in French 00520-345. This is another passage in the document, and I quote, "How would we apply the line of war in order to win?" Allow me to say briefly that thus far the principle of 1 person against 30 is one we have succeeded in implementing. On the battlefront in Somaliland in March, it was 1 against 70. That is to say that 4 Vietnamese succeeded in defeating 90 Vietnamese, but on the battlefront it was 1 Cambodian against 5, 1 Cambodian against 15, 1 against 20. All in all, in the whole country, we succeeded in implementing the principle of 1 Cambodian against 30 Vietnamese. Consequently, the Vietnamese lost a lot of their forces. Of course, they had the mass and quantities, but numerous forces were completely lost. Why did they lose so many people, whereas they had numerous forces, whereas they had artillery, armored cars in larger numbers than we did? And I must explain that their artillery and armored cars were more numerous than ours, but their infantry was not better than ours. Why did we succeed in defeating them? I'll tell you about military matters so that you may properly understand. We observed that we succeeded in implementing the principle of 1 against 30. We did not attack with all our forces. Our divisions were divided into smaller parts. End of quotes, free translation. And here again, we have a typical example of the concept of 1 against 30. And in this particular context, regardless of the terms used, we are talking precisely of fighting and the fact that we are in a situation in which there were disparities between Vietnamese forces and Cambodian forces. And this is where the issue of 1 against 30 was referred to. And in this case, you see again that in this analogy of 1 against 30, they are talking of a civilian population.
Thank you, Counsel. I don't know if it's the translation, but I'm having a little bit of passage location, or if it's the French versus the English. But could you please, again, locate this, if you have it, in the English version so I can find exactly where you are?
Excusez-moi, je pense.
Crave your indulgence, and it is page 6. The ERN, which is the number you see at the top left-hand corner of the page, 00519834.
Okay, and you began reading at the bottom or the top? Because I was not on. I just want to make sure I know exactly what language is being used before I refer to it.
Alors, je suis désolée, je n'ai...
I'm sorry, all I have before me is the French version. I do not know whether it was at the beginning of the page or at the end of the page in English. Perhaps someone who has the English can assist us. In any case, in the terms used at the beginning of the text I read, they are talking of Svay Rieng, and they are saying that on the Svay Rieng battlefront, they talk of 1 Cambodian against 30 Vietnamese, and they talk of armored cars and artillery. Perhaps this would assist you. I was quoting this document, but you do have the document before you.
Thank you, Counsel. I just, because in the text I'm looking at, the word Yuan is used, and I'm just trying to figure out if the register in this is switched to the use of the word Vietnamese, or if this is somehow a translation issue. That's the point I'm confused about. But when I'm looking at, the word Yuan appears everywhere.
Oui, excusez-moi, nous avons...
Yes, your indulgence. I forgot to mention it earlier, but I know that in English you have the right terminology. We had a problem of translation in the French, and we noted this when we referred to this document at the beginning of the or during the documents hearing. I couldn't change the terminology used in the French, but I know that you have the correct document in English and the right terminology in English.
Thank you, Counsel. I just wanted to be sure, because that would be a big register shift if, in fact, the language had changed. But again, I don't want to take up a great deal of time, because I know your time is, you have only so much time. But I think, again, what I said in my previous answer, if you want me to repeat it, would apply to this as well, that it has a military context. It has an emphasis on the battle, the fight against the Vietnamese. But once again, in that battle, it marks difference, it stigmatizes, it uses a word that clearly in Cambodia and Democratic Kampuchea refers to ethnic Vietnamese, whether they're in Vietnam or ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia itself. So in this, clearly there's a military context, as I've said before, and that's part of what the incitement is for. But it also is an incitement towards, in general, ethnic Vietnamese, including those in Cambodia. And, you know, I mentioned the 9/11 example in the United States. There are many examples of the use of racial slurs that are used that are directed in one manner, but are diffuse terms that encompass anybody to whom certain qualities have been ascribed. And I believe earlier I went over all of the negative attributions. I can do it again if you want, that are linked to the term Yuan, you know, the thieving Yuan, covetous Yuan. Do you want me to go over it all again, or? But I mentioned that before. I'm happy to do it again if you'd like me to, or we can proceed.
Juste pour être sûr...
To be sure that I have properly understood your arguments, as far as you're concerned, the use of the term Yuan, regardless of the context in which it was used, even when they are talking typically of fighting, of weaponry, armored cars, and artillery, the simple use of the term Yuan implies that they are also focusing on attacking the civilian population. Is that a correct understanding of your answer? Is that a correct understanding of your previous answer?
Thank you, Counsel. Just to be clear, my argument is that when you use a word that effectively, as I said, there are some cases when this term is used in a manner in colloquial speech where people aren't knowing about the use. So you can find some in Cambodia, some use of it in a manner that doesn't connote strong racism. But it's clear that if you talk to virtually anyone, people are well aware that the use of the word Yuan, especially in context of broader incitement, of anger, of ethnic stereotyping, is a rhetoric of racist hatred. And I think, given this speech, many others that are given throughout CPK publications, radio broadcasts, the word "UN" occurs again and again and again. It stirs up hatred, both that's directed against the troops of Vietnam, and again I mentioned Nyan Chanda, and as one example of outcome were the attacks that didn't just kill people, but they actually led to the mutilation and horrific acts of violence against civilians. That term itself is also a diffuse term that has led to also simultaneously, because it's the use of the word "UN," refer to ethnic Vietnamese in general, including ethnic Vietnamese in democratic Kampuchea, in Cambodia in general. It's a diffuse term. It refers and stigmatizes and stereotypes a group of people. That group are ethnic Vietnamese, and they're ethnic Vietnamese both in Vietnam and in DK. In 1978, many of them have been pushed out of the country or killed, but it's a general term of incitement.
President Judge Lavenge, you have the floor.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. This question is for Council Guisset. Did you identify this discrepancy? Since you saw the discrepancy between the French and the English, do you know whether any request has been made to ITU to correct this discrepancy? If that's not the case, I think we should do so before this chamber. Council, we had observed this discrepancy. The chamber had made that remark, the observation, and I thought they had made the request for correction. But it would appear that the chamber had made a request. We, the defense teams, didn't make that particular request.
President, it is now appropriate for a short break. We take a break now and resume at 10:30. Court officer, please assist the expert during the break time and invite him back into the courtroom at 10:30. The court is now in recess.